Bonjour, everybody. Hope you're doing well this morning. Had a nice weekend. I thought we'd visit Paris today since it's going to be a while before we can go again, as we may have learned this morning. We're not going to be able to travel to Europe for a while. So I thought I'd at least put us in the mood. Hey, look at, I've got a baguette. Tell me that isn't the coolest thing. Can I eat it? Let's see. No. No. Okay. Somebody asked if I know French. I do not. I took Spanish in high school, and I barely know that. Also took a little Hebrew to prepare myself for my bar mitzvah. I know none of that. Never was very good with foreign languages, sadly. But anyway, a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, hope you're hanging in there. I know this things get so overwhelming, and especially with the news of things getting a little bit worse for us here with the virus. I know that's really intimidating, and July 4th festivities have been closed, but hang in there. It's going to get better. I have this fantasy that by next spring, I will see you on campus. Everything will be better, and you'll run up to me and say, Professor Rosenblum, you don't remember me, but I was in your summer class, and I just wanted to say hi, and I'll be so happy to see you because we'll be able to actually talk live. And so we'll look forward to that time. But between now and then, we'll hang in, get through this together, and distract ourselves with some fun science. And baguette. Interesting. I guess the baguette goes to whatever hand is opened. Yeah, look at that. I can throw the baguette. Whoa. Wow. I don't know if you folks know how to do these snap camera things, but that, whoever's doing these is pretty clever. Anyway, a couple of things I wanted to say. The baguette's kind of distracting, but I'll get through this. Okay, so we just got through week 1 of the summer session, and guess what? Next week you have a test, your midterm, and that's the way summer session goes. A couple of things I wanted to say about that. First of all, it's been a long time since I've taught a summer course, so I realize I'm going to have to speed up a tiny bit. Hopefully it won't be overwhelming to you. Hopefully you'll handle it fine, and if it's going too fast, you let me know. So I will have to go a little faster in my lectures today. Secondly, the test will most likely be available to you to take towards the end of next week. And I'm going to give you a good deal of flexibility as to when you can take that test. It's going to be at the end, possibly after Thursday's class, so you might be able to take it between, I don't know, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, something like that. I certainly will let you know that next week. And it will be online. As I told you, it will be open book. I believe I've told you that too. You'll have 80 minutes to do 60 questions, and you'll know about a third of the questions based on the practice questions we're doing in class. Okay, so let me take a second here and see if there's any questions about the upcoming exam. Certainly, I'll talk much more about this Thursday, and we'll be talking about it in detail on Tuesday to make sure you're prepared. I will give you a chance in Wednesday's discussion sections. Serena will give you a chance to ask questions to help you prepare for the exam, but we'll talk more about that too. It just, in summer session, it goes by very quickly, so I just wanted to remind you that next week, late next week, you will have your midterm exam. Okay, let's see if there are any questions. All right. Yes, it looks like there are some. Oh, William loves my stash. Thank you. Actually, that's one of the good things about Snapchat is I can try on a number of different mustaches to see which one I like best, and maybe I'll actually adopt one. But this one, yeah, this one you can hang things from, it looks like, which would be, good to carry backpacks or whatever. Brittany asked if I know French. No, I don't. I'm afraid I don't. As I said, I'm not very good with languages. I'm good at some things, but not languages. All right, was there another question? I thought there were 3 questions. No? Any questions about the exam or anything like that? We'll be talking more about this as it comes up, but in the meantime, I'll just throw my bread around. Okay, if there's no questions, then we'll get right into the material today. So, let's see, we'll share our screen. Oh, actually, sorry, you've seen this already. Let me go through it very quickly. What we're talking about, I'm just going to, you've already seen all this stuff. I just wanted to catch up to where we were last week. What I just wanted to remind you of is the big picture. Of course, we're going through the big story of the class is perceptual skills that one aware of having. And one of the first ones that we've been talking about is being able to use sounds that aren't made by objects, but are reflected and structured by objects in various ways. So that's what I mean by hearing the silent world, that we're not only able to use sounds based on understanding what's making those sounds. We'll learn more about that in a few minutes. But this first pass on sound has to do with how various surfaces in our rooms, in our environments in general, structure sounds and allow us to tell something about the environment that seems, kind of miraculous in a lot of ways. Daniel Kish is the great example, right? The echolocation expert. And by the way, I did post a TED Talk by Daniel Kish. If you haven't looked at it yet, you probably would enjoy just going through it while you're having lunch or something like that later today. I think you'll find it very interesting. He's a really brilliant guy and has a lot of interesting insights into how he's able to do what he does. Anyway, we started talking about some of the other things that can be done with sound, and that led us to talk to folks in the entertainment industry. I think before I talk about those details, I forgot to take off the the mustache. Let me just do that quickly because I don't want to be too distracting. Okay. There I am. Okay, terrific. Great. Oops. Great. There we go. So we talked about the fact that these folks in the entertainment industry taught us, basically, that we are able to recognize the type of room we're in. We're able to recognize the location that we're in that room. And we talked about the issue of shotgun microphones and how that has to be equalized. Then we came to this point, which was this is kind of a follow-up to the insight that that sound engineer, that sound mixer Jay Patterson suggested, and that involved this very simple experiment of rolling people around a room with their eyes closed and putting them in various positions and then asking them either to make noise themselves, like an echolocation sort of noise, or we produce noises for them. In all cases, the sound had to follow them around. And people were very good at this. They could tell they were in a corner of the room. They could tell they were in the middle of the room. And again, this isn't based on some sound in the room like the vents or something like that. It's based on how their own sounds, whether they're clicking, whether it's a sound coming from behind them, is structured by the room. And they can tell all these things at better than chance levels. They're not perfect by any means. And if you're looking at the details on that graph, you'll see that they're around 50, 60, 70%. But given that, chance would be 1 in 9, that's how many positions are in the room, the fact they're that high is really pretty impressive. And again, these are folks that have never been asked to do this before. So I think Jay Patterson's intuitions about this, based on what he's been doing for so long in the entertainment recording industry, are spot on. And yeah, this research suggests that we are much more sensitive to the location we're occupying in a room based on how the room structures the reflected sounds that we make or some other source makes. Okay, which is pretty good. Okay, one more thing, well, 2 more things I wanted to talk about with regard to sound mixers and sound artists in the entertainment industry. First, I want to discuss a little bit about the fact that not only are we good at determining the dimensions of a room, our location in a room, but we're also good at determining when objects obstruct sound. Okay, and this is a story that Sandy Berman gave me, because not only does he do these looping recordings, as I mentioned, but he also does Foley. He's the sound designer, and he's the one that's responsible for taking someone like Jay Patterson's recordings and adding all the necessary sound effects and balancing everything together. He's responsible for everything but the music. So he has to do sound effects. And what you're seeing there, this is a great image. I really love this image. What you're seeing down here is a typical, I guess you would say, well, I think it's a modern Foley studio. It's a modern sound effects studio. But they're using kind of older school techniques. But importantly, they still use some of these older school techniques for certain types of sounds. So imagine, I don't know if you've ever made movies or done recording yourself of any type, but most of how that's done now is done through a computer. You set a computer and you add sounds together and that sort of thing. And that's a lot of what these sound effects people do now. If there's a car crash that's being depicted visually in this scene, they have a catalog of car crash sounds that they will test out to see which work best with the visual event, and then maybe modify a little bit, make sure it's timed right, add different types of kind of effects to that, like echo and things. But for some things, like footsteps in particularly, footsteps turn out to be a really important thing to get right in the Foley studio. They will do it old school. They will get up off their chairs in front of the computers and step on specially prepared surfaces that are then recorded to sound like footsteps that are being depicted. So if you can see, and if you can see this later if you can't see it now, what these folks are watching is a film scene that involves people walking through a park, it looks like. And as these people walk through the park, it looks like they're stepping on leaves. Now, that is recorded in the original filming of the scene, but typically, because of the way mics are set up, it's hard for them to get a good, clear recording of that sound. So very often, for footsteps in particular, they will have to redub that in the Foley studio by doing it themselves. So for something as conspicuous as footsteps, it's a sound that we're very, very familiar with, they will get up and walk over to the kind of little sound stage here and step on either leaves, or sometimes they'll use things that make the same types of sound as leaves, like I think wax paper crinkled up does the same thing. Various sorts of tricks that they've learned to use over the years. And they will watch the characters walking and time their own footsteps to the characters' footsteps. And you'll see there's two people actually doing it now because there's two characters. And that's kind of the old school way of doing sound effects. And I believe that Universal Studios used to have a demonstration of this. I don't know if you've ever gone to the Universal Studios tour, but they used to have a demonstration of Foley effects. I don't know if they still do. But they would show you the old school ways of doing this. And the interesting thing is, even though a lot of it's done just using a computer now, some of the old school ways still have to be used because there's just nothing, as Staddy said, nothing like the real thing. So now here's the issue. Here's the interesting issue beyond that. Very often, when you see somebody walking in a scene, they will be shown walking in something like a cluttered environment. And so you might see a film of people walking down a sidewalk, and at one point, their footsteps will be kind of obstructed by some object. In this case, we have the lamp pole base. What else could be obstructing it? Maybe there'll be a mailbox there, so you would see them walk behind a mailbox, or you would see them walk behind a trash can or something like that. Now, in order for that to sound right, if they are re-recording it in the Foley studio, what they have to do is actually create the same type of sound change that would occur as a person is walking behind a large object, like a lamp pole. So imagine you're standing up over here on the side. Maybe imagine the camera's right here and it's looking in at these people and it's stationary. When somebody walks behind this large base of the lamppost here, telephone pole, whatever it is, their footsteps will be a little bit quieter just for a quick second, okay? You know this is the case. When sounds are behind things, they get quieter, right? When you want a little bit more privacy, you don't want to be, especially now, when you don't want to hear the TV on or your siblings, yelling as they're playing video games, you close the door. It makes sounds quieter. Obstructions quiet down sounds. Well, it's critical, Sandy will tell you, that in order to make footsteps sound real, if you're seeing an obstruction of a footstep sound on the screen, you have to replicate that in the Foley studio. Okay, so what he will do if there's a scene where somebody is, oh, sorry, let me pull this back just so we don't get distracted. If somebody is seen going behind a large object, he will use his own footsteps and then have those footsteps go behind an object that's in the Foley studio. It doesn't have to be the exact same object, but it has to be an object that's pretty close. So what he'll do is he'll put microphones, say, on the other side of something like a small baffle that's about the same width as this object here. And the microphone will go on the other side. So the microphone will basically pick up how the footsteps sound as they are being obstructed by a large object, okay? And he'll tell you, that the baffles have to be pretty close to what you're seeing. What I mean by baffle, again, is just, probably a board or something like that that can be used to kind of mold the sound. In this case, it's going to be a baffle that's going to block the sound behind it. And it's got to be about the right size and shape. He'll tell you that, if it's, for example, something like the bottom of that lab post there, he can't use a baffle that's very, very wide. It's going to be the case that in the real world, the sound of the footsteps will be obstructed for a very short time. So he has to use a baffle that's about the same width of this one. So the shape matters. And so what he's showing us here is that it's another one of our skills to be able to hear the silent world, in that we can not only hear, the shape of a room, the size of a room, our location in it, but we can hear when objects that are not making sound occlude or obstruct the sounds behind them. And we can tell something about those objects. And I thought, this is really interesting. I mean, this is something that psychologists don't know. So we went back to the lab and we tried this out. With a couple of simple experiments. So this is the idea of what I call this is hearing silent shapes. That's kind of a provocative title for it, hearing silent shapes. So the idea is that we can hear sound occluding or sound obstructing surfaces. And to test this, what we did is we took big boards, and you're seeing 3 of them here. There's 2 boards on the side and another board on top. Let's talk about the first experiment, though, that involved putting 2 big boards, and these were boards that were pretty thick, made of pretty thick foam that are typically put in the walls of a home to help with sound insulation. The nice thing about them is they're pretty light, but they're thick, so they do a good job at occluding sound. We wanted to see how accurate people would be at determining the location of sound occluding boards. And so, as you can see here, we set up a series of loudspeakers against a wall. And we had those loudspeakers, you'll like this, we had those loudspeakers playing out a recorded sound that we recorded in the what's it called, the food commons of campus. So I don't know what it's called now. The campus, when we did this experiment, the commons was very different. But you know what I'm talking about, on the ground floor of the commons, where that taco place is, and what else is there? The Asian place. I can't remember the name of all these restaurants. And there's a pizza place where and the place where you can design your own salads and pasta and all that sort of stuff. Okay. Imagine we went in there and made recordings of what it sounded like there. And the reason we did something like that was because we thought it would be a very rich and also a familiar sound to people. And we played that through this set of speakers you're seeing depicted in the image. And then what we did is we moved the boards over those recordings of the cafeteria sounds coming out of all those speakers. And we asked people who were blindfolded So again, let me get some of these notes. And the boards were positioned in front of loudspeakers. We could move them back and forth. And we asked them in our first experiment whether the boards were completely shut or completely opened. And maybe more precisely, is the space between the boards something that you could fit through? Okay, so imagine you come into this experiment. Again, these are one of these crazy experiments that people don't ever think they can do correctly. But they come into the lab and they are told that, you know, we're interested in how you use sound, but in how you use sound as it's being kind of occluded, obstructed by boards. And so what we like you to do is listen to the sound and know that these boards are going to be around you. And we want you to determine whether the space on between the inner edges of the board are in fact wide enough for you to be able to walk through if you had to. Okay, so you can see in this particular case, it looks like the inner edges of the board are in fact wide enough for this person to walk through. And then what we can do is we can, you know, kind of move them a little bit closer and a little bit further apart, and the entire time the subject's blindfolded. And you can imagine it's challenging. So the subject will, you know, start listening after we've moved the board and say, yeah, I think I can move through this one. And then we'll actually put noisy headphones on them as we move the board so they can't hear it move. Take the headphones off, and then the boards might be like this, and they'll say, I don't think I can fit through that one. And as it turns out, they are ridiculously accurate at this. They are as accurate as if they had their blindfold off and weren't using sound, but were instead using sight. This floored us. We had no idea they were going to be as good as they actually were. Again, this isn't based on sounds that the boards are making. This is based on sounds that the boards are occluding or obstructing, that are behind them. You know, the sound to them sounds kind of like just a very kind of, I guess you'd say, diffuse crowd sound. They don't hear it coming from very specific speakers and very specific loudspeakers. It kind of sounds like a big kind of cafeteria general sound behind them. But as it occludes the sound, they can hear precisely where those big boards are and know whether they can walk through it or not. And again, their accuracy astounded us. They are as accurate at determining whether they could walk through that space or not as if they were actually judging it through sight. Okay, so we actually had them come in and do that later on. And of course, we measure to see which ones they can and can't walk through. It's going to be different for different people, but people are very good at judging, you know, how the boards are occluding sound relative to their own width, so they know they can walk through it. And we did a follow-up experiment that looked at whether people were also good at judging whether they could walk underneath a board that was hanging off the ceiling. So we removed these sideboards now and just had a big board hanging off the ceiling and moved that up and down over the speakers and asked subjects if they could walk under that board without ducking. Okay, so but I guess, can you guys see this on me? Yeah, I guess this is about the right height. But if it's down here, if I were correct, I would say no. And again, people are really, really accurate at this. And it's one of those things where, again, people have no idea they can do this. All right, and people are great. Subjects can judge the space between the edges of the two boards and whether they can climb under it. And they are just surprisingly good. It really floored us how good they were. And it floored the subjects too. They, after a little while, say, oh, I can do this. This is something I can do. I didn't know I can hear such detail about the location of sound obstructing sorts of boards. We love experiments like that where we show people they can do things they didn't realize they could do. As you know what, that's the book. That's what the book is about, of course. Okay, so given that, we ask, can we really push this? Can we, now that we know that they can be so good at these sort of judgments, can we make them do something even, I guess, more sophisticated with occluding sound? Could we ask them to judge not the location of big boards, but the shape of smaller things? Can they judge the shape of smaller things? So according to Sandy Berman, you know, people, again, are sensitive to whether the shape of the object that's occluding a sound in the Foley studio is, in fact, the right shape and size given what they're seeing on the screen, right? And so he would say, yeah, they probably can. So we tried this out. And we tried it out first by making it relatively easy. We asked them to judge whether there was a large disc, triangle, or square in front of them. And there you can see the exact setup we use, and there's a subject actually doing the experiment. And this obviously is the triangle shape, and the square and the circle are about the same size. And again, they're just foam. You know, we covered it in, I guess, tape there so they wouldn't fall apart over the course of a long experiment. But that's just foam there. They're not making any sound, but what they are doing is occluding, obstructing the sounds that are behind them, in this case, that are produced by these little speakers here. And again, imagining coming into this experiment, and this was, I remember very vividly what would happen typically. We would show people the shapes on the floor and say, we're going to put those in front of these speakers, and we're going to see if you can judge which shape is up there based on how the shapes obstruct sound. And here's your blindfold. And people said, I'm not going to be able to do this blindfolded. And a lot of people said to us, this experiment is really about ESP, isn't it? This is an extrasensory perception experiment because there's no way I'm going to do this. But after a few trials, they say, oh yeah, I can hear that the shape of the thing that's covering up these sounds is different from the last thing I heard. I think this one's the triangle. I think the next one is the square, and the next one's the disc. And people could do this at better than chance levels. We were impressed. We had no idea that they would be able to do this at all. I mean, we were encouraged by the previous experiment with the two big boards, but we had no idea that they'd be able to do this. And we looked at the data, and some people are better than others, maybe not surprisingly, and we were wondering what distinguished the good people from the bad people. In fact, some of the good people were getting it 80 to 90% correct. Remember, and when you have three different objects here, chance performance is 33% correct. So if people are getting it 80 to 90%, they're doing really, really well. And they would do it quick too. I remember, the folks that were good at this, we'd put up the triangle, they'd get in front of it, and for maybe 2 seconds, they'd move their head a little bit, and they say triangle. And then they sit down, we put up the next shape, they'd stand up, and they say, square. They were fast. And so we tried to figure out what made some people better than others. Everyone could do it better than chance, but some people were amazing. And we looked to find, we got back in touch with these folks, and we said, you are especially good at this. Can you give us any insight as to why you might have been so good at it? Because it turns out the people that were good all had a little experience doing some sort of kind of like sound manipulation for either in the form of being a DJ. I mean, I remember we had a DJ, and he plays parties and weddings and stuff like that. He has wonderful equipment. I remember he told us, but he doesn't he doesn't make his own recordings. He plays recorded music. But what he needs to do is he needs to go into the location of the wedding, the party, and set up his speakers in the best possible way so people can hear the music well. And then we also had somebody who did sound engineering for his church. Again, he would be the one that might be sitting out in the audience, as a lot of, as you probably know, a lot of churches have these amazing bands, amazing choirs. And so there's music throughout. And he would be sitting out in the audience, and he'd be the one controlling, the balance between the instruments and the choir, or between the drums and the guitar and stuff like that. And he said, that's probably why I'm good at this. I'm a careful listener, and I have a sense as to how things will sound, if there's obstructions in front of them. And so the folks that did really well did have more experience. They weren't aware that their experience would be able to allow them to do this. They said, they were as surprised as anybody that they could do this so well. But the fact that they could do it at all is really is impressive. The fact they could do it so well is probably, in fact, attributable to their experience. Even doing minimal sound as a DJ or in a church or something like that. I think it's really interesting. Okay, let's move on and talk about this last point. And so as I'm going through this, you're thinking, okay, this is kind of cool that we're able to do all these things with sound that we didn't think we could do. But I mean, how good are we at this? Are we really good at this? Or, is it something that a sound engineer or a Foley artist, somebody working as a DJ really can do, but the rest of us, it's not that important and we're not that good at it? Well, if you talk to these people, you talk to Jay Patterson, you talk to Sandy Berman, other folks in the industry, they say, oh yeah, it's there. It makes a difference, even if you're not consciously aware of it. Again, remember the idea, like, you have to be engaged with the scene. If you're distracted in any way, like the sound isn't good enough, you're thrown out of the scene. And they'll tell you, not only is it important, but it's getting more important. And what they claim is folks in your generation are getting more sensitive to these characteristics that I've been talking about. Okay, before I talk about the details of why that's the case, let me give you one more example where it's not the younger generation that's good, but actually an older generation that's good. And I talked to, and you know this if you've gone through the book, I talked to a sound mixer designer named Zoli Asaze. And he had, I don't know if he's still working there, and I don't even know if this soap opera is still on. Is Days of Our Lives still on? Anyone know? Don't be embarrassed if you're a fan. Okay, but when I interviewed Zoli, he told me that Days of Our Lives was the longest running soap opera, over 50 years or something like that. And they had fans that had been watching Days of Our Lives for 50 years or nearly 50 years and stuff like that. And he gave, I said, so he was one of the last interviews I did for this chapter. And I said, okay, so all these guys are telling me that we are really sensitive to these things. I mean, do you feel the same way? Or do you think that maybe you're kind of just doing it for other sound engineers? You're being so careful for, I said, no, let me give you this great example. And he said that, I guess at one point, they switched the types of cameras they were using from, the normal kind of handheld cameras. I think they use multiple cameras for a soap opera, to cameras that were actually remote control cameras that were on like tracks and things like that. So they didn't actually have cameramen that were holding them. The cameramen were in the booth with the director and could control the cameras using remote controls. And they just found that was a much more effective way of doing it. They didn't need like walkie-talkies to give direction to the camera operators. So what they needed to do is they needed to kind of reorganize all the sets to make room for these tracks that the cameras can move on. And that forced Zoli and his friends to have to move things like the baffles and blankets that were in each set. So he gave me this example of, I guess there's a character, Bo, one of the main characters' names is Bo. On the show, and I guess there's a lot of scenes in Bo's apartment. I mean, it's one of the most used scenes. I don't know the soap opera, but I guess, him and his friends, him and his wife, whatever, they talk a lot in there. And they had to reorganize the set because of the tracks that were added for the cameras. So they had to move the baffles, they had to move the blankets, but they thought they still had something that sounded very much like a bedroom or apartment. I guess maybe this is the main part of his apartment. I don't know if it's a bedroom or not, but anyway, so they started, continuing with the filming of the soap opera after the cameras were added and after the baffles were moved. And the next week, he told me he was getting boxes of real mail, snail mail, paper mail, sent to the studio, addressed to the director and set designers of the soap opera, saying, what did you do to Bo's apartment? It doesn't look or feel right. There's something different about it. And they were very careful when they had to reorganize it, not to move any of the pieces that were visible on the set. It's not like they moved a couch or anything like that. They just moved the blankets. And all of these, I guess it's a very popular show with the older crowd, and a lot of older people wrote in using paper mail, because that's what they I guess preferred at the time, at least, saying, what did you do with Bo's apartment? And they actually had to go in and listen to old recordings of how it sounded in Bo's apartment, and had to try to replicate that by again reorganizing the blankets as much as possible. And he said, listen, these folks that wrote in didn't know why they were kind of I guess, distracted by, the apartment. They thought it might have had something to do with the color or of the paint or something like that. But it was the sound. We know that because when we fixed it, we didn't get any more letters. And we were surprised by the sensitivity. So these folks that had been watching it for a very long time were very sensitive to how the voices in Beau's apartment sounded, how they were reflected, and they had to reorganize it again so it sounded like it used to sound before they added these new cameras, which was absolutely fascinating to me. Anyway, getting to your generation. Your generation that is has grown up with much higher quality sound than my generation. Now, I know we could argue, and I know some of you folks are going to say, well, Rosenblum, you grew up with LPs, with records, and a lot of folks say that's better music sound than listening for streaming and stuff like that. That's debatable. But even kind of ignoring that for a second, the fact that, I said last week, the sound you're getting through your television is so much better than the sound I got through my television growing up, regardless of whether or not you have one of these surround sound systems. Okay, the little tiny speaker in your flat screen TV is much better than the speaker I got, so it's definitely better. The headphones, the earbuds are probably much better quality. I would say that for most of us that grew up with records, our stereo, even if it was expensive at the time, could not reproduce the quality of music you would get through streaming. Okay. Yes, you're listening on iPhone, but the fact that if you're listening with headphones coming from iPhones, your sound quality is a lot better. So that's not just true, of course, with music. It's also true with movies and video, and the recording techniques are much better as well. And this is something that they all said to me, that in fact, people are getting more sensitive to these kind of subtle differences that we say are so important. And I thought one of the best ways to really demonstrate that was based on my interview with this great architectural engineer, Yasuhisa Toyota. So what does an architectural acoustician do? I have a video, a picture there. Okay. Well, let me just show you very quickly. He, Mr. Toyota, is that's him on the left right there. Wonderful guy. He has a very kind of humble office here in Los Angeles. And he's now very famous, very, very successful. He designed the interior of the Disney Hall. He redesigned the interior of the Sydney Opera House. So, when you see pictures of Australia, the Sydney, Australia, you see this kind of cool amphitheater type building that kind of looks like waves. He redesigned that. He's been the most in-demand architectural acoustician in the world, probably for at least 15 years now, because of what he's developed. Okay, I'll talk about that in just a second. But when I talked to him, I asked him again this question I was asking everybody: do you think that the subtleties in the acoustics of a room, in the reflected sound, are dimensions that listeners really are sensitive to? And he said, absolutely. And when he designs interiors of concert halls, he's thinking about how clear CD quality sound is. Now, when I interviewed him, that's what we were talking about, is CD quality sound. But of course, it also is true with many of the streaming services. It is near CD quality sound. And even if you don't think that that's as warm as an LP record, and I know some of you are probably collectors of LPs, the clarity is certainly better. Some people find that a little overwhelming, the clarity of the sound from digital music, whether on CD or streaming. But it is really, really conspicuous how clear things sound. The other thing he said is that, especially when it comes to things like classical music, which is generally what he's thinking of when he designs these interiors, is that these days, what they do is they use dozens and dozens of microphones many of which are placed right on the instruments in order to record classical music for, streaming or CD or whatever. Okay, that wasn't always the case. When I was a kid, my dad was a real classical music fan. I remember, we would look at pictures on the back of the albums of how they recorded the music. And what they would basically do is they would just take two microphones, because they'd be in stereo, cool, and put them like in the middle of the audience section of a theater, and then record the orchestra that way. So the orchestra was recorded with two microphones, two high quality microphones. And they sounded great. I mean, it sounded good to me, these old classical records. But now what they do, and if you listen to old versus new classical recordings, you can tell this, is they put the microphones right on the instruments. Here's a guitar. What they would do is they would put the microphone maybe right here on the sound hole, if it in fact was a classical guitar sort of concert. And they would do the same things for the violins, and the trumpets would have a microphone right in front and of all that sort of stuff. Okay, so that close miking makes a difference. And people who are fans of classical music have gotten used to that type of miking technique, as well as the clarity. And so of digital music, there it is. I mean, even if it's not warm, it is so clear. So he feels that people have gotten more sophisticated in their listening in some important ways. They are listening for specific instruments and a lot of clarity. So he has had to design the interiors of his amphitheaters to replicate what people are used to listening to on recordings. And that has allowed him to develop something called the vineyard design. And you are looking at the interior now of the Disney Hall. I assume you guys know what the Disney Hall is. It's like that really cool looking building in downtown LA, where the LA Philharmonic performs. And you're looking there at the interior of the Disney Hall. Don't know if you can see the details of this, but it's not really like what you would imagine a typical concert theater to be like, unless you've been to concert halls a lot in the last, say, 10 years. Look how it looks. You see how there's kind of tiers of seats that are at a very steep angle, right? And they're on the side. Some are even behind where the orchestra sits. And this is, in fact, how it would look all over the theater. Sections of very steep rows of seats. And the sections are kind of divided off by these really nice wood walls here. And that's how it looks all through it. And he calls this a vineyard design because, like, if you've been to vineyards like in Napa Valley or something, they have rows of these the vines, the grapevines on hill sides, right? So, they have like rows going down the slope of a hill. And that's kind of how these look. This is now the design in what's considered the best concert halls in the world, okay? The Disney Hall. Halls that have been revamped in New York City, as I said, the Sydney Opera House. This is the new interior design, because what this allows for is for sound to get to the listener with exceptional clarity and what he calls intimacy. So the sound would leave the orchestra, okay, and kind of emanate up the kind of the incline here. And because the way this is designed, the distance between the listener's head and the orchestra is actually shorter than it normally would be in a more kind of traditional type of a design, like concert halls where there's a, big seating section, on opposite the stage. The fact that all these seats are around the stage and at such a, kind of great incline, at such a sharp angle, allows people to be, in a sense, closer to the musicians, okay? The other thing that this allows sound to do is actually reflect off of the walls that are separating the sections. I don't know if you can tell it from from this image, but there are walls that divide the sections from each other. So the sound comes up and does go directly to the ears of the audience members, but also any reflections are going to be very nearby where they are sitting. It's not like the sound, there's a lot of sound that goes around and bounces all over. It's true, some of it does, but the most sound that the listener is getting is coming either directly from the orchestra or from very nearby reflecting surfaces. And what this does is exactly what Mr. Toyota wants to do. He wants to give people the feeling of being very close to the instruments so that the instruments sound especially clear and especially close. I mean, it is really miraculous. If you guys have ever gone there, let me know if any of you have ever been there and what your experience is in the comments. But if you don't, before you leave Southern California, make sure you go there because it really is almost like an illusion. You're sitting, what would seem, you're kind of far back, the orchestra looks small. It's a big theater, but then when they start playing, you feel like you're on stage with them. You feel like the violin is right next to you. In fact, I remember the first time I went, when they first started playing, there was a violin solo. And I thought sometimes orchestras do these fancy things where they place the musicians out in the audience kind of as a gimmick, and maybe they walk down as they're playing the violin. And I thought that's what was happening because it sounded like, even though I realized the violinist was down on the stage like the rest of the orchestra, it sounded like that soloist was right near me. And that's a function of how this is designed. And Mr. Toyota says he needs to design it like this because that's what your and young people's sophisticated auditory systems are expecting. You have gotten more sensitive to these characteristics. Just a little anecdote about how clear the sound is. So when they first built this, I mean, people were astonished. It really does almost seem like an illusion when you go in there about how clear the sound is. And what they realized is that there's a kind of a side effect about how these things are designed. So not only do you hear things clearly that are coming from the orchestra down on the floor, you're hearing things clearly that are coming from other audience members. So, especially like in the cold and flu season, if someone's got a cough, someone's got is sneezing, you will hear that very clearly in the audience. So even if they're way across, the other side of the theater, you're sitting way up here and someone's sitting way up here, if they start coughing, you're going to hear that as clearly as you hear the orchestra. And they realized that, they then kind of made some modifications so it was a little bit better. But what they did, I remember going in there like the second year it was opened, and they would put big bins of cough drops, free cough drops that you could take as you were going in. And they say, hey, listen, if you got a cough, please take a bunch of these because we don't want other people to be distracted by the clarity of your cough that's a byproduct of this great amphitheater. Which worked. You didn't hear them cough, but what you did hear is them unwrapping the cough drops. It wasn't as bad as the cough, but I remember laughing. It's like, oh my gosh, this theater is so good, so clear that the sound of the unwrapping of a cough drop is clear from, hundreds of feet away. I thought it was really interesting. Anyway, okay, that, I guess this is just a little review. You don't need to write all this down. We are exquisitely sensitive to how room structure sound, and I think Jay Patterson, Sandy Berman, Mr. Toyota certainly has shown us. We are sensitive to the sound of different room positions. So where we are located in a room, we're sensitive to when sounds are obstructed and how they are obstructed, the shape of the obstructions. And then finally, despite what, we might think that maybe this is really not worth it for, the industry to put so much money and energy into, as it turns out, we are really sensitive to these things. And according to everyone I talk to, we're getting more sensitive to these things because the technologies of home listening and movie theater listening have gotten so good that we are very, very sensitive when things don't match up well. So these people have to work even harder than they used to work. Okay. Let's take a break and see if there's any questions. All right, looks like there's a question or two. Yes, Ralph asks, I would imagine after seeing something so much over time and memorizing almost all the details in the apartment without realizing it, and all of a sudden experiencing a small change would create a sense. Yeah, you're about Beau's apartment. Yes, here you're talking about the soap opera example with Zoe Asase. Yeah, he said that they were very careful when they added all these tracks for the cameras not to move any piece of furniture, any picture on the wall, everything. They put a lot of time into making sure it looked exactly like how it looked before, and they tried to make it sound like an apartment, but because they didn't put as much energy into replicating the acoustic characteristics as they did the visual characteristics of the apartment, that people were really kind of distracted by it, which I think is just so interesting. He thought it was really, he was surprised that people were so sensitive to the sound and really had to put more effort into it. So they listened to the old recordings and tried to get the new sound of the room to be as close as possible, which I thought was fascinating. Other questions? Other questions about sound. Has anyone been to the Disney Concert Hall? Well, when they reopen, hopefully soon, not too long from now, I really recommend you go. Especially, students get quite a discount. They really do. I think you can get a nice seat for like $20, $30 as a student. I mean, they really want young people to go, and I should also say, okay, here's my plug for the LA Philharmonic. That they are one of the most, I guess you would say, progressive concert companies in the world, in terms of really featuring new young composers. And so, it's not stodgy. It is not stodgy. Yeah, people get dressed up and there's a lot of old people in the audience, but that doesn't really make it stodgy. They play really, really progressive music from composers from all over the world, and they're very, very open-minded to things. So for example, okay, so I was going to get into this when I was going to talk about music later on, but I'll talk a little bit about now. Right now, I've been listening to a lot of movie music, especially by oh God, I can't remember his name right now. Here, let me quickly switch. Yeah, Max Richter. I don't know if you know who he is, or what's her name? Hildur Gundertier, something like that. And these are classical composers that make now music for movies. And in the old days, this used to be considered something that really didn't overlap. If you were a serious classical composer, well, there's some exceptions to this, but in the old days, typically, at least when I was a kid, if you were a serious classical composer, you didn't do music for movies or TV. But these are people that are serious classical composers and but are playing modern music with synthesizers and kind of very interesting orchestrations. And that type of music is played by the LA Philharmonic. So, for example, I know a lot of you have probably seen the Joker movie, right? I don't know if you remember the music, but Hildur, whose last name I can't pronounce, actually won the Oscar for Best Score for that movie. And if you go back and just listen to that score, it is amazing. It is kind of classical music, but it's very modern and very kind of emotional in a very modern way. And that's what you could hear. You could hear that live with these, some of the world's best musicians playing this stuff. And it's really, really powerful. Oh, we have some fans. So Brittany's a Max Richter fan. What pieces do you like, Brittany, if I can ask you? Do you have any favorite pieces? Because I was just listening to, as I've been doing my writing, I've been listening to his 8.5-hour piece called Sleep. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but it's 8.5 hours long. I didn't listen to it all in one sitting, but over the course of, 4 or 5 days, I listened to it all. And it's beautiful. And it's exactly the sort of thing that the LA Philharmonic would play that you'd be able to hear. So I'm encouraging you, this is one of the things you could get excited about. When everything clears up, everyone's doing better, try to make an effort to go there over the next few years. So Nassim, you've been there? You've been there, is that right? You've been to the Disney Hall? That's great. Oh, and Brittany says The Notebook. Absolutely. Oh, that's great. Good. Yeah. So his classical piano piece is in The Notebook. And Nassim's been to Disney Hall. Did you notice how good the Blue Notebook? Thank you. Nassim, did you notice how clear the music was when you were there? Did you notice how kind of how close the instruments sounded? Because I think it's really. Oh, there you are. Okay, let me turn the sound up. Go ahead.
So yes, actually we had the military, they had a military discount too, not just a student discount. Yeah, actually I have a hearing loss as a military personnel. I have a severe, but I can hear everything's there, smooth.
Amazing.
I can see between all the notes, what they call, like all the different voices.
Yeah.
Normally in the normal days, I cannot recognize those. I give you example. I have a high frequencies problem. So normally when the woman talking and babies talking, it takes me time to understand what they say. They have to look at their lips, but there it was amazing. I wish I can use it with me. I take it.
Yeah. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. That's really interesting. It is phenomenal how he's able to do this, and you know, you can understand why he's been one of the most in demand engineers. He does this by kind of the way he shapes the interior of theaters, and so now many theaters around the world have adopted the same sort of style. A number, I can't remember, there's been a number of concert halls in California on college campuses that have adopted the style, and he's consulted with. So absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for sharing that. That's great. Okay, let's go ahead and do a question really quickly. And then we'll get back to the lecture. Let's see. Let's just do one here on sound obstruction. This should be very easy for you. Actually, nah, I'm not crazy about that question. Yeah, nah, let's do it. All right, let's do sound obstruction. It's not a great question, but okay, here we go. So research shows that when an object obstructs or occludes a sound, we can hear that object's, these are awful answers. I don't know where I got these from. Answer A, cost. Answer B, shape. Answer C, color. Or answer D, both B and C. I'm going to try to improve this question. But anyway, I'll give it to you now. Go ahead. Should be easy since we just went through this. Yeah, everyone knows this. Probably instead of color, it should have said location, and then we could have it as B and C. But go ahead and just finish this off. The correct answer here should be pretty obvious. Looks like most of you have gotten this. Don't want to spend too much time doing it. Okay, I will end this here. Well, okay, there's 10 of you, there's 12 of you, 10 of you have answered it. I think we're good enough. The answer, of course, is B. You know, I guess when I wrote this question a number of years ago, I wanted to make it so that I had some questions that even though the answer D was both B and C, there was only one of those that was correct. You can't tell color. You can't tell cost. I don't know where I came up with that. What you can tell is shape. So that is the correct answer. All of you gotten it right. That's great. That's the right answer. But you also probably can tell the location to some degree. I'm not sure why I didn't include that as one of the answers, but that doesn't make a difference. You got it all right. Way to go. That question will be on the exam. Okay. Sorry. There you go. There's the finish poll. Thank you, Kimberly, for reminding me of that. Everyone got it right. Take a picture of it. It's B. Even though it's a crappy question, if I can say so myself, I will keep it just like this in the exam so it doesn't confuse you. The other thing, though, just if you're interested, that people can judge is the location of the occluding object, but shape is the most obvious thing here. Okay, so there's no question B is the correct answer there. Great. Any other questions before we get back to our lecture? Anything else? Oops. Cool. I will then start our next lecture, which is going to be on sound still, but on sound emanating. Oops. So we will start with something I had mentioned. Oh, hold on just a second. Hold on just a second. Just take a second here. Where's this? Very strange. All right. Huh. Okay, sorry about this. I'm missing a couple of slides on this. I don't know how that happened. There we go. Okay, we're good. Good. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Let's go ahead and now share our screen. And we are going to, hold on just a second. Yes. We're going to talk about auditory approach. And you can tell what we're going to be talking about in this context is this amazing story about beep baseball. So I knew about beep baseball from when I was a kid, and my dad, as I think I mentioned, was the director of an agency for the blind, and I used to go to his office and see all these really interesting kind of devices that were designed to help the blind, you know, and enjoy life and be safe and all that. And one of the things he showed me was exactly this baseball, softball, as you can see, that makes a beep sound. If we can hear this. It's loud. And this is beep baseball. And so I've always been interested in it, and I thought this would be a really cool thing to discuss in the book. So I went to the Beep Baseball World Series, which that year took place in Houston, and got to talk to these athletes and learn all about the sport and about its history and about you know, the sort of things they do to improve their skills as they're playing. So let me show you a little bit about this. First, I'm going to show you a little video, and I know videos don't translate well over Zoom, but it will give you a general sense of how things occur in beep baseball, and then we'll talk about the history.
If you can imagine running full speed in the darkness 100 feet toward a buzzing target, it's at first, if you're doing it for the first time, there's a lot of fear involved. Willing to sacrifice your body and potentially get hit with a ball that's coming at you at a decent speed.
Okay, that just gives you a general sense how it's played. It's not completely clear from that, but let me give you the general rules. So there are two teams, as in normal softball, baseball, and everyone wears a blindfold except the pitcher and catcher, which I'll talk about in just a second. But as I think I mentioned before, the reason that blindfolds are used is it kind of equalizes the fact that, you know, some people are completely blind, they have no light vision at all, others have some light vision and potentially could use that, so everyone wears a blindfold to make sure people aren't using their sight at all. It's all done based on sound. The way it works is the batting team takes turns, just like they would in softball. They do it one at a time. A batter will get up and swing to hit the beeping baseball. Now, a couple of things I can tell you about this is, first of all, the pitcher and catcher are actually on the same team as the batter. So if you were ever in Little League, they have there's a couple of years where they use what's called coach pitch, which means that the coach of your own team pitches you the ball to give you as good a chance to hit it as possible. That's the idea in beep baseball. The pitcher is trying to throw it so you can hit it as easily as possible. And I think there are 4 pitches or 5 pitches rather than, or four strikes, 5 strikes rather than 3 to make it easier for the batter. And the batting, averages are very high. They're like 600, 700, whatever, 60, 70% connection. And after the batter hits the ball leaves home plate and goes out. And his job as the batter is to drop the bat and then run to one of two bases that are roughly in first and third base position. The bases that they are running towards are these big foam posts. So this one, I guess, would probably be in third base position about. There'd be another one exactly like it in first base position. And they don't know which one to run towards until they hit the ball. As soon as they hit the ball, an umpire sitting behind the catcher presses a button, and one of the two bases starts randomly to make a noise, a buzzing sound. So that's that buzzing sound you heard in the video. You hear the beep, 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 beep of the baseball, but then you hear, eh, and that's the sound of one of the bases buzzing. Again, the batter doesn't know which one's going to happen. Nobody knows. It's picked randomly. But as soon as it starts buzzing, the batter has to run and get to the base by hitting the foam before the outfielders have possession of the ball. So there they are right there. There's an outfielder who has possession. He jumps down on the ground, grabs the ball, and says, "I got it." And the umpire looks to see whether the batter reached the base first or the outfielder got possession of the ball first. If the batter reaches the base, a run is scored. If the outfielder gets the ball before the base, before the runner gets to the base, then an out occurs. And I think there's 4 or 5 outs for each half inning as well. Okay, so the rules are very different. But it is an exciting game. And I think the thing I want to convey maybe most about the game itself is how seriously these folks take it. It is a great time. I mean, they bring out their families. You know, people have picnics. Remember those? People have picnics. They're having a great time with their family. But the athletes themselves take this very seriously, especially, you know, when they all get to the World Series. You know, I mean, they train for many months. And yes, everyone's allowed to do it. No one's cut from the team, but they make sure everyone's playing at their best, and they take it very seriously. It's really impressive. They have a great time, but you know, at the same time, they're training for long periods of time. Because there's quite a history. This game was invented in 1964, probably not too soon before I actually went to my father's office back in probably the late 60s to see the beeping balls. But they've had World Series since then. Now, I think there are about 16 teams. There might be a few more now in the U.S., but there are also teams in Japan. And I think there's some teams in Europe. But the U.S. teams do play Japan's teams regularly. And they, you know, I've talked to the athletes, and they say, oh, yeah, the Japanese temes are amazing. They are really good. And I think they typically do beat the U.S. teams, for whatever reason. So they take it very seriously there. As I said, the pitcher, yeah, everybody is allowed to play, and they are visually impaired. I believe it's co-ed, both women and men, I think, yes, as I remember. And it's anybody who's visually impaired can join the teams. So it runs between, you know, teenagers that are, you know, older teenagers, 15, 16, 17, up to guys in their 50s. And so there was some folks that had been playing for a very long time and still loved it and still took it very, very seriously. As I said, the pitcher and catcher are sighted, and usually they are siblings of some of the blind players on the teams. You know, they want to help out and they want to have a good time. And these folks, this pitcher especially, were really great athletes on all the teams I saw. What they do is they spend days and days practicing with each of the batters to throw the ball exactly where the batter has a best chance of hitting it. And different batters have different styles, as you can imagine. So the pitchers have to really kind of adjust their pitching style differently for every single batter on the team. And have to, you know, rather than trying to strike them out, they're trying to put the ball in the best possible place. It's not like they just kind of throw it, you know, softly. These are fairly fast pitches because it allows the batter typically to get I guess a longer hit off of those types of pitches. So it's pretty cool. So as I said, the batter and the pitcher are spending a lot of time practicing, and they are really practicing rhythmic coordination. So yes, the batters do use the sound of the beeping balls to do the batting, but In addition to that, the pitcher will give verbal signals to the batter. So they'll go, ready, set, go, and then throw the ball and release it upon the word go. So it's ready, set, go. And the batter knows then how to time the pitch relative to when the pitcher said go. So they're still using sound, and the beep does help, but very often they will practice even without a beeping baseball. Where sound is most important is first the fielding. So here comes the beeping ball. So now I'm out in the field, and I can't remember how many. I think there's like 6 players, maybe 8 players out in the field, and they're spread around the field, basically in kind of a front row and a back row. And their job is to grab the ball, as I said, before the batter gets to the base. Okay, so here I am. I'm out here in the field, and the ball will typically be bouncing on the ground, and I have to stop the ball first, probably with my body, and then grab it with my hand and lift it into the air as quickly as possible. And so I'm going to have to use the sound of the approaching ball to make that judgment. Okay. Now, a couple of things about the ball before I put it away. You might notice that the speaker here is in one position. What that allows, in other words, it doesn't have loudspeakers all around the ball. And that's intentional. What that allows is for the batter and, most importantly, the fielder to be able to hear the ball spinning as it comes towards him. So I don't know if you can hear this, but it's louder here, softer here. Occlusion, right? Can you hear it spinning if I do that? Not sure you can hear it spinning, but you get the idea. Since the speaker's only on one place, the sound allows the fielder to hear how the ball is spinning. And they'll know that if it sounds like it's spinning a lot, that there's a chance that when it hits the ground, it's going to continue for a further distance. If it's not spinning very much, then maybe they can jump to the ground differently because it's not going to be rolling as much. Okay, so that is one place. The fielding is where sound is very critical, and also running. But let's continue talking about this fielding situation. So I'm in the field. Here comes the ball. I'm using sound. I'm using the sound of the approaching ball to make an important decision, and the decision is where to jump onto the ground to stop the ball, and when to jump on the ground to stop the ball. Okay, this is really important. So I have to time my diving. So imagine the ball's coming here. I can hear it's coming a little bit to my right, so I'll have to jump to my right to stop the ball. Okay, but if I jump too soon, I might not jump exactly in the right position. If I jump too late, I'll jump after the ball's past me. So I have to be able to jump at as a precise time as possible, so I can jump where I know the ball is going to be, but not too late so it passes me. So I have to time my diving of that jump onto the ground pretty precisely. Okay, so I'm going to use the sound of the approaching ball for that purpose. And that's why the slide, by the way, is called auditory approach. That's kind of the concept I'm most interested in understanding, is how is the fielder going to perceive the approach of a sound in order to time their diving sort of behavior. Okay, that's one place. The other place is in running to the base. And I don't know if you noticed this, but you can kind of see it here. As the runner is running to the base, what they're doing is they're guiding their run based on the sound, that buzzing sound that the base is making. So they're running towards the buzzing sound, okay? But they have to run as fast as possible. And you might know something about running. Running is faster if we can pump our arms. Okay, so they will absolutely, as soon as they put the bat down and they leave the base, the runner will start pumping like this and run as fast as they can towards that third base post that's making that buzzing sound. Buzz. Okay, here I am, I'm running towards it. However, in order to increase my chances of hitting the base, what they'll do is at the last minute, they will extend their arms to hit the base. Okay, they'll open up their arms to hit the base and have more of a chance. Because if they're running like this, there is a small chance they might miss it since they're running so fast. If they want to increase their chances, they will open their arms, and that's going to help them a lot to ensure that part of their arm at least will be hitting the base. So what they need to do is time when to open their arms, to time when to open their arms so they have a chance of hitting the base, a better chance of hitting the base. But if they do it too late, okay, they will possibly miss the base. If they do it too soon, though, you know, if they're running to the base and say, boy, I want to make a chance that I want to make the chances greater that I'll hit the base, and they do it too soon as they're running, okay, they're not going to be able to run as quickly. They want to be able to use their arms to pump and help their run as long as possible before they reach the base, and then at the very last second, bam, like that. So in both of these cases, what these folks are doing is they're using what we can call auditory approach or auditory anticipation to make their judgments, whether it's judging the ball coming towards you in the outfield to know when the fielder is going to jump to the ground to stop the ball, or to make a judgment about the best time to open the arms so the runner knows the best time to hit the base without slowing down their run. And that's really what we're going to understand next, is this idea of auditory approach. How are we doing on time here? Yeah, I got 2 minutes. Let me continue with this a little bit more. Oh, you know, before I do, somebody sent this to me a few years ago. I think you'll find this great. It's a sport I didn't know very much about, but I've learned about since. It is tennis for the blind. I don't know how well you can see that, but that's just amazing. So these are blind tennis players. Okay, you can see the court's smaller. The ball isn't making a beep in this case. What it is, basically, it's a regular tennis ball, but they fill it, they make a tiny hole in it, and they fill it with like little BBs, buckshot. You know, it's kind of a rattling sound, and they're able to play like this. Again, using the ability to be able to perceive the approach of the sound. Now, the rules are a little different. The court's a lot smaller. The net's lower, of course. It looks like they get 2 bounces on each side. Is that what it looks like to you? Yeah, hopefully the video is okay. I should mention I also posted on our YouTube site a video of blind tennis players, so you can learn probably more about it there. But I mean, it's just amazing. They're able to guide their racket in terms of the racket's position and velocity and all that based on this rattling sound that's coming from the ball. It's just amazing. Okay, why don't we take our break here, and we'll come back at 11:30. Oh, let me see. It looks like there's one question very quickly, and I'll answer that, and then we'll go to a normal softball. Oh, so Brittany asked, is this actually, that's a very good question. Do you folks think this is bigger than a normal softball? It might be. I thought it was. It says official softball on here. I thought what they just did is they took softballs and put the beat mechanism in here. But it could be, maybe there's different types of softballs, and maybe this is one of the larger ones. This is the ones for kids. I know I've seen smaller softballs, so maybe for fast pitch softball, the balls are a little smaller. I don't know. Some people think it's big. Some people think it's the same size. I guess there's different types of softballs, but I believe that for little kids, this is the type of softball they might use. I can tell you that they don't create the softballs from scratch. There are, a handful of people around the country that modify softballs. And I guess what they do is they use the biggest ones. And I imagine they use the biggest ones exactly based on your intuition, which is that it is easier to grab and probably hit but you know, it's still a small ball. So, okay, great. Thanks everybody. I'll see you in about 10 minutes. All right, mateys. Thought I'd mix it up a little bit here just to keep things interesting. Hope you all had a nice break and you're all nice and refreshed. Feel the nice sea breeze on your skin here. Let me know if you get seasick. All right. Anyway, all right. Any questions before we continue talking about auditory approach? Nope. Good. All right. Let's stop this silliness and do this right. All right. Good. Then we will go ahead and share our screen. Good. This is where we left off, right? All right. So, given these amazing abilities by these blind athletes, whether they're the beat baseball players or these amazing tennis players, they're both using the same type of information. It's a type of information that, as it turns out, our brains are especially sensitive to, which I think makes it an interesting topic just generally. And so this is actually, kind of one of your skills as well. I mean, it would take you some practice, of course, to be a beat baseball player or a rattle tennis player, whatever. But you are able to judge the approach of sound sources especially well. And your brain does seem set up for that purpose to some degree. So let's talk a little bit about the type of information first that might be useful to do this type of skill. So let's think about running to the base as an example. And what's going to be used here is sometimes referred to auditory approach. Sometimes it's referred to more generally as being able to perceive time to arrival. How much time is it going to be either before we are at the buzzing base, or the ball, the softball is at our position? How much time? And that's what, in a sense, your brain is having to judge, because, certainly, before we get to the buzzing base, we have to know when to open our arms up at just the right time. And so what we're doing, in a sense, what the brain is doing, in a sense, is making a judgment of how much time before I get there, how much time before I arrive at the base. Okay, I want to do that as precisely as possible. So my brain is judging the time to arrival, and it can go again. Work both ways, whether I'm running to a base or the ball is coming towards me. Okay, same deal. What type of cues does the brain use? And you've already learned a little bit about some auditory cues for echolocation, but these are going to be a little bit different. So what are the types of sound patterns that will allow our brains to make these sorts of judgments? And some of these are going to be fairly intuitive. So here's a list of them. But we'll start with the most intuitive one, which is intensity. And the idea here is, as the ball gets closer to us, it gets louder. Hopefully that's working for you. Yeah, so loud. Can imagine that why it has to be so loud. I mean, this is a really useful sound outside, but even though we look like we're outside, we're actually in my garage, so it is very loud. But as the sound comes towards you, its intensity gets greater, and it's something that we all have experience with. If you want to understand what somebody's saying at a party where there's a lot of background sound, what you'll do is you'll move towards them, and you'll be able to hear them better, and you'll be able to hear that you're closer to them as well. So what happens when a sound gets closer to you? Well, its amplitude increases. And don't worry too much. Amplitude and intensity here are the same types of thing. It gets louder. So intensity, amplitude, loudness, for our purposes, we can all kind of talk about these things as being the same. But what's important here is not just that it gets louder, but it gets louder with a changing rate of loudness, or a changing rate, according to this graph here, of amplitude. So that's really what I want you to catch here. This is the amplitude or loudness as the ball comes towards me. As the sound source approaches, okay, it gets, here, let me get this a little bit more comfortable for me, yeah. As the sound source approaches, it does get louder, it grows in amplitude, but not in a straight line sort of way, not in a way that we might say is linear. It's not a flat sort of line. Instead, the amplitude kind of changes slowly at first, and then the closer and closer it gets, the faster the loudness changes. You understand? So we won't use the ball. We'll use a pretend ball. Here's the ball coming towards me, and it's going beep, 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 beep. And what I tried to convey there is it didn't increase at a regular kind of amount. Instead, at first, it increased a little bit at a time, beep, 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 beep. But then as it got closer, it increased its loudness faster and faster. And that's what this graph is in fact showing here. Oops. That's what this graph is showing. It changes a little bit slowly at first, but as it gets closer and closer, that line gets steeper and steeper. By the way, this is just the line if I miss the ball. Hopefully I never will if I'm playing beep baseball, but if I miss the ball, this is what happens. The sound decreases, and it decreases quickly at first, and then as it goes further and further away, the sound decrease kind of slows down. It continues to decrease, but its rate slows down. And the fact that it's at this shape, that there's a kind of a changing rate of amplitude as it comes towards me, is something my brain can use. My brain can kind of sample along this line and tell something about when the ball will be at my position. So it makes use of the fact that it's not kind of a consistent increase in sound, but the sound amplitude changes slowly at first and gets faster and faster as it comes closer. Okay, so let me get a little bit more on this slide just to make sure we understand the concept, and I'll go back to these other ideas of complexity and Doppler shift and things. It's the rate of change, how quickly the sound is getting louder at any one time, that can tell me when the ball will be at my position or I'll be at the position of the bass. Okay, so let's stick with this idea of the ball coming towards me. I hear it kind of coming towards me. That's very clear. I can also determine its rotation, as I said, because of its position, where the loudspeaker is coming from. But I will listen to, my brain's going to be listening to the ball kind of change its amplitude slowly at first. And then as I hear the amplitude kind of get louder and louder, but at a faster rate, okay, my brain can then judge when it's going to be at my position. In other words, my brain can look at this, kind of listen for this change, and it say right here, it's like, oh boy, this is better. This better be where I jump then. It's too early here because the sound is changing too slowly. But now the sound's changing really, really quickly. Time for me to jump. So the brain's looking for the rate of change. Okay, that's the idea. Hopefully you get the general idea of that. But let's go back and talk about these other things. And you should know these, but I'm not too worried about that you know the physics behind them. But when a sound gets closer to you, not only does it get louder, it gets brighter. Okay, and maybe the most intuitive example of this is, you know, when you're at you're at an intersection, you're at the stoplight, and you hear someone's got one of those great stereos in their car, and they're playing some, you know, hip hop or something like that. And when they're far away, when they're way behind you, right, you can hear the bass coming. Boo, 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 boo. So I actually, don't tell my wife, but I really like these things. I know they're a little intrusive, but I love the sound of the bass kind of making my car vibrate too. If they were in front of my house, I wouldn't like it, but at an intersection, I'm cool. So they're coming towards me, and I hear the bass, and I might not know what song it is. I might not know even what type of song it is as it's coming towards me. And then as it gets closer and closer, I start to hear more detail in the song as the car gets closer. I hear the bass still, but now I'm starting to hear maybe a voice. It gets closer still, and maybe now I'm making out that there's a keyboard part to it, and it gets closer. Now I can hear this, you know, kind of other percussion instruments. So what's happening as it's getting closer and closer to me, it is getting louder, but I'm also hearing things more clearly. And that's what this complexity thing means. And complexity really, it's not a great term for this class, but the sound structure it gets more complex, as we call it, meaning that there's more bright parts of the sound that are present. That's what complex means. What else happens? Something called the Doppler shift. And maybe you've heard this the term the Doppler shift in the context of weather reports, Doppler radar. But in this context, what we're talking about is how sound changes as something's moving towards us and then away from us. And what it comes out to, I don't think I'm going to be able to demonstrate it like this, but I will try. Let's see if it works. What I want you to listen to is not just how it gets louder and then softer as it goes past me, but if there's any change in the pitch of the sound, meaning, whether the beep sounds like it's getting higher and lower in its pitch. Let's try it. Maybe. Yeah. Did you hear it switch a tiny bit? Maybe this isn't the best sound for this. But what you should hear, it should have been sounding I'm going to exaggerate it now, but it should have been sounding something like this. Beep, 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 beep. A little bit like that, like all of a sudden the thing's going down, the pitch is going down a tiny bit. Beep, 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 beep. You hear it going down. It's going to get louder, of course, but the pitch is shifting too. And you've probably noticed this, like with ambulance sirens, as an ambulance or a police car is going by you. I'll just do an ambulance siren, like a European ambulance siren. It's like a dee-dee-dee-dee. All right. So it's coming towards you. Dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. Oh, sorry. Let me try it again. Dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. And when it's passing you, it shifts down like this. Train whistles. That's the Doppler shift. And it's something we know our brain can use to determine that a sound source is coming towards us and passing us, and where the sound source is. So this is another kind of acoustic dimension, another cue that our brains can use. Other things, well, interaural. All of this means is that when a sound source is, say, coming from our right, it hits our right ear before our left ear, and it's also a little bit louder when it hits our right ear before our left ear. It's a little louder in the right ear. So here it is out here. Can you see this? I can't see my body here. Okay, so the sound is just me snapping out here, and it's hitting my right ear before my left ear. It's also a little louder in my right ear. You know why? Because your head acts like an obstruction. Remember we talked about sound occlusion, sound obstruction, and my head, because it's especially large, acts like a really big sound obstructor. So my left ear is getting the sound a little quieter than my right ear. Right here, both, when it's right in front of me, both ears are getting the sound at the same time and getting it with equal amplitude. And then as the sound source moves away from the other side, now my left ear is getting it before my right ear, and it's getting a little louder than my right ear. And that's what's meant by interaural differences. It's the difference in sound to the two ears, interaural. And so this is another way our brains can judge the approach of a sound source. If in fact a sound source is coming directly in the middle towards us like this, then there's not going to be a difference in the two ears, but that rarely happens. And even in beep baseball, the ball's always going to come a little bit to the side. If you're going to be jumping down to the right, that means the ball's going to be coming towards the right. And there's going to be differences in the sound to the two ears depending on where it is as it's coming towards you. So we can use those sort of cues. And then the final one is something you know about, and that's reflectances. And we know that as a sound is far away, like especially in a big room, maybe not so much outside, but in a room, we get a lot of echo information, meaning that a lot of the sound, okay, here, I'll show you this picture here, that this, if someone's playing guitar and you're sitting listening to it, the sound is coming directly from the guitar. It's also bouncing off the walls, and this is the reflected sound. And the further away you are, the more reflected sound you hear relative to the direct sound. The closer you are, the more direct sound you hear relative to the reflected sound. And that is going to systematically change as a sound source gets closer to you, or you get closer to a sound source. Now, I know this all sounds a little technical, but here's the thing I want you to realize about this. That with all of these different cues, intensity, complexity, Doppler shift, interaural, reflectances, Your brain's looking for the same type of thing. The rate of change, so like I illustrated it with the amplitude, the rate of change is going to inform the brain when the sound source will be at my position or when I will be at the position of the sound source in the case of hitting the bass. The third bass. So the idea is that it's looking for this change, whether it's a change in the amplitude, or this is the Doppler shift. It's kind of pushing waves together and pulling them apart. Interaural or reflectances or the complexity, like I illustrated with the car coming towards you at the stoplight. It's looking for the kind of rate of change to make this prediction, to make this kind of judgment of time to arrival of when the sound source will arrive at our position or when we will arrive at the sound source's position. And there's research on this. We conducted some research on this a long time ago, but other people have continued with this research since. And what it involves is asking people to make judgments of things like, recorded cars approaching a microphone or something like that. Sometimes even, beeping balls and things like that will be judged. Just to give you a sense of how this is done, sometimes you'll hear the recording of a car coming towards a microphone. So, you might record this, on a deserted street somewhere, and you've got maybe we'll use the interaural microphones that you folks have learned about. We'll put them in the ears of a listener, and the car is going to be coming towards the listener, and we'll be recording that sound. And then we'll take that recorded sound of the car coming towards the listener and edit it and then play it for people in the laboratory. And a typical way of then judging how well people are at judging the time to arrival is to do this, to play just maybe the first 2/3 of that recording and then have the recording stop before the car actually is heard passing the listener or passing the microphones. So typically you would hear something like, there's a car approaching and then passing. But instead, in these experiments, you'd hear, and then it would stop. And the subject's job would be to push a button when they believe the car would pass them if the car kept making sound. So they're going to hear, and it would stop, and then they go right there during the silent part. Okay, so they're going to make anticipatory judgments or time to arrival judgments. And what you find is that, first of all, people are generally really good at this, even if they've never done it before. They're fairly accurate. Maybe unsurprisingly, the blind are better at this than the sighted. That maybe isn't too surprising, right? I mean, that's, they have more experience. They have to rely on this information more. But the sighted are pretty good too. There are some errors, though, and the errors, interestingly, almost always go in the same direction. They always go in the direction of caution. People over-anticipate. They'll say the sound source, the car sound, will be there before it actually will be there. Okay, so here's, I'm gonna kind of, let's do it this way. Here's the car coming towards me. Okay, it's going past me like that. Like that. Okay, now what's going to happen is I'm going to make just the sound that the subject will hear, and then the sound's going to go off just like the subject would experience, and then I'm going to press the button when I think it's going by me. See what I'm doing? I'd be correct if I pushed the button when the car was right at my, quote, position, but instead, I'm almost always going to over-anticipate. I'm going to say that the sound source is there before it is. Blind people do this, and sighted people do it too. You can learn to improve this skill, and certainly that's one of the things I'm sure that the beat baseball players have to do, because they are probably going to over-anticipate too. I imagine when they're first learning to play, they jump sooner than they should to the ground and maybe pull their arms out if they're running to the base. They have to learn to kind of compensate for their inclination to over-anticipate. But that's often what happens, at least in the beginning. And I think it's a good thing, because it's the safe thing to do, right? Except for the accuracy needed for something like beat baseball or rattle tennis, it's better that you judge the sound source as being at your position sooner than it actually would, so you can get out of its way, as an example, right? So if a car is coming towards you, you want to think, if you're going to make an error, you want to think that it's going to be there before it's actually going to be there. So you give yourself time to move out of the way. So that kind of, I guess you can call margin of safety or kind of over caution is evident in how people typically over anticipate sound sources. I'm going to talk about an actual example that's very relevant. I know this sounds very abstract right now, but I'm going to give you an example of the relevancy of this in just a second. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the brain, because some interesting neurophysiological research has been conducted on this sort of thing. Because it's something I think a lot of people who study sound have noticed, that, beyond the examples of beep baseball and rattle tennis, that we do seem to be really good at perceiving the approach of a sound source. I like to give this example. It's going to be an example of how we use approaching sound, but maybe more obviously, it will be an example of the huge nerd that I am. Okay. When my kids were little, those baby Bjorn things, they're like little strap things that allow you to carry your kid around on your chest. You've probably seen these sort of things, right? I used to love to carry my kids around and go on walks like down the street into the park and stuff like that. And both my kids did this. I don't know if you've ever experienced this with the baby Bjorn, if you have kids or you have nieces, nephews. But the kids would have, they love doing this, of course. They get to hang out with daddy and get to go outside. But both my kids would always love to hold my fingers, kind of like almost as if they were riding a motorcycle when they were doing it. They're tiny, like what are they, 2, younger maybe, less than 2. This is before they want to run around, they're not able to do very much. So they're happy to get outside. They would hold my fingers like this, like they're riding a motorcycle. And I remember both my kids did this, I think even before they were 1, that when we were walking down the street, if a car was coming from behind us, okay, coming towards us from behind us, so it was a car that neither of us could see as we're walking this way, I would feel my kids squeeze on my fingers in kind of coordination as the car got closer and closer. So as the cars would approach from behind, this is all now auditory information they're using, they're squeezing my finger harder and harder until the car passes them. It's not like they're scared necessarily. It's almost as if they're just alert to it. Okay, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is so cool. This is such an obvious example of how, we seem to be so sensitive to this auditory approach to information at such an early age, right? Okay, I told you it was going to be a better example of my nerddom than it is an example of approaching sound, but still, I thought you'd enjoy that. But it does seem that this is something that we're sensitive to at a very early age, and that our brains kind of devote a good portion of their auditory sensitivities towards. Okay, so as we're listening to something like the increasing intensity of a sound, so as the ball's getting closer to us, as the car's getting closer to us, sounds that increase their intensity, like that, our brains react in a really interesting way. It's not just that the auditory part of our brains light up, the parts that are typically associated with sound sensitivity, but increasing intensity, unlike decreasing intensity or constant intensity, okay, also activate areas that are associated with attention and motor reactivity. So this sound, like that, when that gets louder, versus this sound, or this sound, which are decreasing and constant intensity, it's only that first sound, increasing intensity, that kind of alerts the brain that something's coming towards us, and we become more attentive, and we prime our motor system to react as if we're, ready to get out of the way, which is good because, one of the things the auditory system does for us is it alerts us to things that might be threatening that we can't see right away, like my son and I walking down the street and hearing a car coming from behind. That was kind of, his little, squeezing reaction was kind of exemplifying, the way his brain was probably reacting both attentively and motorically to the sound coming towards him. It's exactly what you would want the auditory system to do if it's going to help warn us, okay? And in fact, we have a higher proportion of brain cells that are sensitive to increasing intensity than to decreasing intensity or constant intensity. So not only does our brain get primed by the sound of something coming towards us, but we seem to have more brain area dedicated to sounds that are coming towards us or increasing in intensity, the same idea here. So it's not something that's just specialized to the blind baseball player and the blind tennis player. Our brains seem designed to do a good job in prime motor reactions and prime attention when we hear something coming towards us, as shown through the increasing intensity and how our brains react that way, which is kind of cool. Okay, one last topic I wanted to talk about with regard to auditory approach, which I think you're going to find interesting, especially being a Southern California resident, is something I like to call the Prius problem. And I wouldn't be surprised if you folks have heard about this, because it's something that's made the news since I wrote the book. Back when about the time I was writing the book, Priuses were becoming very popular, hybrids and even some electric cars back in 2010. Now, you might not know this, but Southern California is the largest purchaser of hybrid cars and electric cars. I think that's still the case, and partly that's because of, people do tend to be a little bit more environmentally conscious here, probably because of the issues we've had with smog, and gas is really expensive. You might not know this if you haven't left Southern California in a long time, but gas is more expensive in Southern California than pretty much anywhere else in the country, and that's because of the taxes that are added that are then used to clean up the air, which has helped. And gas, by the way, gas is very, very clean in Southern California too. That's the other thing you're paying for is to clean up the emissions, which they've gotten down pretty well. Before you were born, back when I moved out here in the early 90s, there was smog, a serious smog problem. Things are better now. And we're still conscious of the issue, though. No, we have to deal with it. So Priuses are very popular. Looking out on my street here, I'd say almost every driveway now has some sort of either hybrid or electric car. You probably know it too, in your neighborhood, or you've certainly been in an electric car or been near an electric car. It's not like that in the rest of the country necessarily. It's a real Southern California thing, but it's growing across the country. But when they first became so popular, there was something about them that was noticed, especially by the blind community, that both blind and sighted pedestrians started reporting difficulty hearing hybrid cars, especially when they were going slower. Okay. So maybe you've noticed this. You've been walking through a parking lot and have been distracted by, I don't know, looking on your phone or something. And all of a sudden, a car just appears out of nowhere. And very often when that happens, it is in fact some sort of hybrid car moving at a slow pace. Now, it turns out to be that when a hybrid car or an electric car is going slowly, and the hybrid's in its electric mode, okay, it really doesn't make very much sound, right? And in fact, it's something that it can be, as you'll see, almost functionally silent if it's going slow enough. And so this started happening, especially in the context of parking lots, people walking through parking lots. People walking down their neighborhood street and in cars backing out of driveways. When these cars were going slow and they didn't have these combustion engines that are louder, people were having trouble hearing them, and there were a lot of near misses. The blind noticed it first, and then sighted people would say, yeah, I'm starting to notice this too. Sometimes I'm getting a little scared that I'm getting so close to these cars in parking lots, right? So people went out and they did some measures of a Prius, cars like Priuses and Camrys and things like that. And the Camry at that point, I think Camrys now are all mostly hybrid, but back then in 2009, whatever, they were, ICE stands for internal combustion engines. And they were measured for how loud they were. And when they were both going above 20 miles an hour, the Prius and the Camry, they were both loud enough. The Camry was a little bit louder, but the Prius was loud enough because when a Prius typically goes above 20 miles an hour, it's in its combustion engine mode. But also there's tire sounds and there's air sounds rushing over the car that make them audible, okay? However, when they are going at a slower velocity, when they are going at, so there's very little dB is decibel, sorry, loudness difference at normal traffic speeds. Very little loudness difference. dB is just loudness here. I apologize for putting that in there. It's from another slide. But there is this kind of range of speeds where a Prius is much quieter. And I didn't make up this term, the silent but deadly zone. But when a Prius goes less than 20 miles an hour and is in its electric mode, or if it's just an electric car going less than 20 miles an hour, it is substantially quieter. And what I have here is a recording, two recordings, one of a Prius going, I think, 5 miles an hour, and one of a, I think that was a Honda Accord. Yep, it was my Honda Accord. That was a combustion engine. These recordings were made back in 2009 or something. And you're going to hear the cars coming towards a microphone and then passing them. And hopefully you'll be able to hear these okay. Let me make sure I'm turning it up loud enough. They're both quiet, I should mention, so you have to listen carefully. Here comes the Honda. They're quiet. And here comes the Prius. Okay. Not sure you can hear the difference there. It might not convey well over Zoom, I apologize. But even from my computer here, just listening on my little loudspeakers, they're both quiet. You know, cars are designed to be quieter these days in general, but the Accord is much more noticeable. And you'll see that if you do recordings of the cars, just in terms of how you do measurements of the decibels, a combustion engine car is louder even if it's going that slow. But we decided to actually just do some perceptual research on this. Actually, the National Federation of the Blind contacted us because we had done some old research on the perception of approaching cars. So yeah, sure, we'll help you out. And we thought it would be an interesting thing to do and an important thing to do. So what we did is we took people out to a parking lot behind the UCR campus. I don't know if that church is still there. There was a fellowship center or church that was across the street from that kind of natural food grocery store that I think is still there. And we took subjects out there and basically drove cars past them. And there you see somebody standing out there listening as cars were coming past them. And the cars would drive at a slow pace, about 5 miles an hour. And the listeners would be blindfolded and would be asked to push a button as soon as they knew which direction the car was coming from. Is it coming from the left? Then push the button on the left. If it's coming from the right, then push a button on the right. And that will tell us that you know that the car is approaching and that you can hear enough so you know where it's coming from. Okay. And we tested a 2006 Prius and a 2004 Accord. You're seeing the Prius there approaching the listener, 2006 Prius approaching the listener. And we also did one other thing. We wanted to make it as real as possible to what people would encounter like in a parking lot or in a city street or, you know, a neighborhood street or something like that. And so we had two other cars that were idling about 30 feet behind the listener. So there was a little background sound. And then we thought that would put people in kind of a normal situation. And then we asked to see whether they were more accurate and could determine when the cars were passing them, depending on whether it was the Prius or the Accord. Okay. Well, as it turns out, as you can anticipate, they were in fact more accurate with the Accord because it is making a louder sound, and they could do it sooner. That's what much faster here means. In other words, they could determine whether the accord was coming from the right or left when the accord was still 22 feet before it passed them. Okay, so maybe right there, if that were the accord, they'd be able to tell it was coming from the left or right. With the Prius, they could not determine whether the car was going to be passing them from the left or right until the car actually passed them by a foot or so. Okay. They could anticipate correctly the approach of the accord when it was still safe enough that they could move away from it. For the Prius, they couldn't tell where it was coming from until it actually passed them. That's what negative 1.6 feet means, that they couldn't push the button. They didn't know which direction it was coming from. They didn't even really know it was there until it was right in front of them and even a little bit past them for about 2 feet. Okay, so yeah, I mean, in terms of the perceptual, kind of the perceptual utility, the perceptual detectability of these two cars, it is much harder to hear the Prius. And before we even had a chance to kind of, we shared these results at conferences and stuff and started to write it up for publication. But before we even did that, the National Highway Transportation, I can't remember exactly what that, NHTSA came out with injury results showing that pedestrians had a higher incidence of pedestrian accidents with slow-speed hybrid cars than with slow-speed combustion engine cars. So proportionately speaking, certainly at that time there were more combustion engine cars, but proportionately speaking, okay, when cars were going slow, there was a higher proportion of hybrid cars that were involved in pedestrian accidents, people walking across an intersection or people, walking in a parking lot, than there were combustion engine cars. So we didn't even really need to publish the results at this point. People realized this is this problem. Now, yes, you're thinking, well, the cars are going slow. How hurt can people get at 5 miles an hour? Trust me. When a car's 2 tons, heavy, that hitting somebody, even at 5 miles an hour, especially if you're an older person or a person with a handicap, you're going to get seriously hurt. And people were getting hurt in parking lots by hybrid cars at a disproportionate rate than they were combustion engine cars. And of course, this becomes an even greater problem when they're now not only hybrid cars, but more electric cars, and they're becoming more and more common for good reasons, but it is an issue. And the blind community was correct in pointing this out to us and asking for solutions. So now there are warning sounds that are built into cars. I have a 2016 Prius now, and there is a very, very quiet sound that is made by the car artificially when the car is going slow. Now here's the good news, and this is something you now know about. Your brain is so sensitive to approaching sounds, it doesn't need a lot of sound in order to perceive approach, okay? It just needs enough to kind of kick it off. And so you don't need I remember when we were kind of talking, when we were sharing this research with people, we would get Prius owners that were so angry saying, you're going to make my beautifully quiet Prius noisy. You're going to add a beep, like this type of sound to it, and it's going to be a racket. And the blind said, no, we don't want that. We just want cars to sound like cars, and we want everything to be quiet, but they can't be silent. And fortunately, I think that the car companies have pretty much followed that up by doing the right thing. So now on my car, there's a very quiet sound that's been added, and it's only, I believe, implemented when it's going at a slow speed. And you probably wouldn't even consciously notice that it's a sound that's there, but you now have a sound that your brain can use to help you determine, how to move out of the way or something like that. So I think the problem's been addressed in a nice fashion. But it's the fact that your brain is so sensitive to approaching sounds that allows the manufacturers to be able to solve the problem without making the world a more noisy place. Okay, let's take a little break there and see if there's any questions. Any questions on this? anything that we talked about with regard to approaching sounds or how our brain reacts to it, or Prius. Has anyone had a near miss as a pedestrian walking around, or at least been surprised by a Prius coming towards you? Anybody? That's okay. You almost got hit by a Prius. Yeah, Ralph did. Yeah, I remember when this first happened. I mean, there's actually there's a few things that were done on TV, kind of portraying that. So I remember there was this show called Weeds that was about drug dealers. It was kind of a lighter show about drug dealers, but at one point, somebody who had I think it was a cartel or something, said that he was going to buy Priuses for everybody so he could sneak around at night to do his drug sales because nobody could hear them. There were a number of things on the Colbert show that he did something with Priuses and how quiet they were and stuff like that. It was in the news for a while. Chase says that he has a Tesla. Yeah. So I don't know if the Tesla comes with a sound or not, or an optional sound, but I think they had certainly been talking about it at one point. So yeah, it's the same exact problem. Nobody is going to investigate it. Ralph says it's good to have a Prius if you're a drug dealer because no one's going to investigate a Prius for drugs. You're right. Yeah, Prius are probably for people like NPR listeners like me. All right. Anyway, great. Thank you for your input. Let's do a quick question to help you with your exam. What do we got here? Yeah. Oh, this is so easy. Let me see if I can get a more challenging one to you. No, this is okay. We'll use it. Okay, now let's think about this for a second, though, because I want to make sure that I made this clear in the lecture. So it's going to be a question about beat baseball players and when they're using the approaching sound. So think about this just for a second. Don't answer right away. The question is, in beat baseball, which of the following actions rely most on auditory approach information? A, pitching. B, running to a base. D, diving to stop the ball in the field. Or D, both B and C. There you go. Take your time and read it. Make sure you answer it the way you think it's correct. Good, you guys are doing great. Good. Anyone else want to answer? You're doing great. And while you're doing that, I will load myself up with this. All right, I think we're fine. It looks like 7 of us answered, which means that some people may be, not quite engaged. All right, that's fine. Okay, I will end the poll and share the correct answer with you. The correct answer is D, so the answers are both B and C. It's not actually used during pitching. So the pitcher doesn't really need the beep of the ball. The batter is using it a little bit, but as I mentioned, most of that is a kind of more of a coordination of timing between the pitcher saying ready, set, go, and then the knowing kind of it, being able to time the swing based on that. So it is most important in running to a base. As I mentioned, you need to know when to stick your hands out at the right time. You can't do it too soon or it will slow you down. You can't do it too late or you might miss the base. So you're running towards that buzzing base. And of course, the other example is C, which we've been talking about a lot, having to dive down onto the ground to stop the ball. And you can't do that too early or you might not end up jumping in the right direction. And you can't do it too late or the ball might bound past you. Okay. I should mention, I did see this happen, and I guess it happens once a game. Not all the balls are grounders. I mean, sometimes the balls are pop flies. Sometimes the balls go up. And I did see somebody catch the beeping ball on the fly. They do have catcher's mitts. I think most of them do, or not catcher's mitts, but gloves on, baseball gloves on. And somebody was able to the ball was hit to them, and they I guess listened carefully, and as it came down, they put their hand out in front of them, and they were able to catch it. And I guess it happens once at least a game, multiple times a game. It's a hard thing to do. When I see you on campus next year, you can come back to my office and we'll play beep baseball catch. It's a hard thing to catch the ball on the fly. It's coming pretty quickly, but people are able to do it. So it's not just being able to stop the ball in the field. It is actually sometimes catching the ball on the fly. I thought you'd like that, but let's go ahead and put this away and then close this and go to our next lecture. Okay. Which is music perception, one of my favorite topics. I really like this topic. I learned a lot when I was doing the research for it. I actually hadn't done a lot of reading about the music perception literature until I started writing the book. And what I'm going to tell you is this. The big story from the music perception literature is this. That until recently, we thought a lot of what we would call musical expertise, analytical listening, was something only trained musicians could do. But research has come out over the last 10, 15 years to show that just by being a regular music listener, listening to music, if not daily, every other day or something like that, you have a level of expertise that we never realized. You can hear a lot of nuances in musical forms that we didn't know that untrained listeners had. And we know that from two things. First of all, we can do brain scans and see that people who haven't been trained in music have brain reactions that are actually similar to those that are trained in music, that have played instruments for a good part of their lives. But maybe even more simply, a lot of times the questions have to be asked correctly of people who aren't experts. And this is kind of an interesting lesson for psychology in general. What's the right task for a subject to do for them to show you their best performance? And I think that's really evident in music. When you ask the right questions and kind of have people go through the right methods in the experiment and have them perform a task in a very intuitive way, they can show you that they're sensitive perceptually to things that you normally wouldn't know. I'll come back to that point in a second, but the good news is by being a music listener, your brain is pretty sophisticated with music, much more than we used to think. Okay? So what about this idea of perfect pitch? And I start talking, I won't play you, I often play the recording of this choir that I discuss in the book, this expanded barbershop choir, these guys that sing kind of barbershop style songs with 100 folks or 200 folks or something like that, where they have to synchronize their the words of the songs and their pitches so precisely that it takes months and months of practice to do that, and then they compete against each other, and it's really quite something. I went to go hear them perform, and I thought, okay, these guys are going to be as nerdy as me, but it's going to be kind of funny to watch them. You know what a barbershop quartet's like? It's the thing with, if you've ever seen it at Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farms, it's, these guys have mustaches like I was wearing this morning, the handlebar mustaches and the straw hats. They have they have the old barbershop outfits on with the stripes and stuff like that. They sing really nerdy songs. But when you hear 200 people singing these songs in unison and so well rehearsed, it is so impressive. And they achieve something close to what's called perfect pitch. And what perfect pitch is basically is the idea that you could hear a note and sing very close to what that note is, okay? So, for example, you would hear a note like this. Can you hear that okay? Probably, yeah. And then somebody would be asked to sing that note. I'm not a singer. Before I freak anybody out. I'm much more of a guitarist than I am a singer. Ah. And you hear me try to reach the note, and I wave a little bit, right? Let me try my very best. No, I'm still waving. Did you hear go like that a little bit? Okay. Most people, without vocal training, do that type of thing. Okay. And then the question is, after I kind of hit it, how long? Can I be consistent? Let's see. Let me try that again. My consistency is better than my initial hit of it, I think, if I can say so myself. I think a lot of us are like that if we're not trained singers. Trained singers are better at this. They absolutely are better at this. So when I sang that note, okay, I might have sounded a little like this. Let me see how I can do it. Yeah, that's me, right? It might have sounded like this. I'm exaggerating it now, but do you hear the difference? A trained singer would be pretty much right on there. And then they would do this. Right? Okay, not so noisy, but they would be very close to the pitch they were supposed to hit. And basically what we say, is that the trained singer, the idea is achieving and maintaining a produced target pitch. That's what we're talking about here. It's pitch matching. And the barbershop ensemble will be very, very close. I will be less close. Okay, so let me explain what this says here. Pitch matching, trained singers are superior, so that's not surprising. I've worked with lots of singers before, and they can certainly do this much better than I can. But what's the difference between them? Well, okay, a semitone, because we're going to be using this term a lot, is basically the kind of frets on the guitar fingerboard or the notes on a piano keyboard. So as I go up what's called chromatically here, that's a semitone. Okay, that's a semitone from here. That's what the term semitone refers to. Okay, so when I try to hit that note, I might do something like this. Okay, so I would start actually maybe 1.3, at least a full semitone apart. I'm a little bit more trained than, say, the person who never sings. They're not even comfortable with Happy Birthday. They might be 1.3 away, but a trained singer will be so close. It will be like this. Okay, there'd be a very little wavering. So the barbershop ensemble, I bet, is even closer than 0.5. So 0.5 just means that it's not. Can you see what I'm doing here? It's not a full, fret away. That's me. The barbershop quartet's like this. And what I'm doing is I'm just bending the string a little bit to get a higher pitch. Okay, so that's not surprising. That's not surprising. But that's pitch matching. What about free pitch? What about if you just asked me to sing a song without having to listen to a note and match the note? Would I be okay? And this is an experiment that was actually studied exactly with that type of purpose. How are people at singing free pitch, where they get to pick the notes? And then you can record them and then measure how consistent they are when they go back to that note. Okay? And here's how they did this. I can imagine being in this experiment. It would be such a strange thing. They actually the experimenters just went to a park in Quebec, in Canada, right? And they asked 40 people who had no real singing experience to sing basically a very well-known Quebec folk tune. I think it's actually the national anthem of Quebec. If any of you are from Quebec, you might know it, and you can feel free to sing along. But here it is. I will play it for you. I'll show you where I think people start the song. The version I have has a little introduction to it, but then you'll get an idea of where most people would start the song and how the song sounds that they're trying to sing. Hopefully you can hear this okay.
Qu'on a pris pour dire je t'aime, c'est le seul qui reste au bout de nos jours.
It's in French.
Les feux que l'on fait, les fleurs que l'on sème, chacun les récolte en soi-même. au beau jardin du temps qui court.
Here comes the main part.
Chant du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Chant du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour.
Okay, everyone wants to sing along, they can. I'm hoping you guys can hear that okay. Did you hear it? Maybe thumbs up or something like that if you can hear it. Yeah. All right, I'll assume I'm actually not seeing everything, but it's okay. I'll assume you heard it okay. So it's da 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 da. Okay, like that. But they could start anywhere they wanted to. Okay, they could do it in a preferred key, meaning that they could, make it lower. Da 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 da, like that. And the question is, now that they're not having to actually match a heard tone like that. Was actually in that key. They can start anywhere they want. Are they going to be consistent? And here's what they found. Even though these people said, I'm so embarrassed, I don't want to be in this experiment. I hate singing for people. I don't feel like that comfortable to be recorded, but go ahead if you need my data. They were very self-conscious. Even though that occurred, okay, they found that people were very, very good. So the note they ended on was very close to the note they started with. It was just one semitone away at the very most, okay? What was also surprising was how accurate and consistent their tempo was. Their tempo was as consistent as the folks in that barbershop quartet you're seeing there, as consistent as who's a great singer from your generation? Adele, right? She's got a great voice, right? People are, so, once that song starts, da 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 da, they're consistent in the tempo as Adele would be in singing the song if she were asked to sing the song, which is pretty amazing. And then they were really surprised by this. So they actually went back and asked another 40 subjects to do it again, but this time they asked them this: sing it slowly and sing it as accurately as you can, okay? Try to be good with the pitch. And when they did that, they started in a key they were comfortable in, again. I don't know, da 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 da. That might be a good one for me, right? If I'm asked to sing this slow, my wavering from the beginning of the song, which starts on this note, wait. That's it, right? That's the melody. When they sing that note again later on, they might just be a little bit, tiny bit off, but just even less than a semitone. Rather than it being, so it might be. Can you hear it? You can barely hear that. I mean, that is barely noticeable. When people are left to just sing in the most comfortable way, slowly, carefully, they're actually really good, right? They're actually really good. Now, you're thinking, okay, I've watched, which is the one? It's not The Voice, it's the other one. No, not America's Got Talent. America's Next, I don't know. It's the one where, you start off seeing the really bad singers who are trying to make it big, right? And then they go to the final thing and everyone's a good singer by then, but in the beginning, you get people that are singing really badly. There are people that are bad singers, and we'll talk about those in just a second, but most people, like me, sing badly because they don't have practice and they don't know how to control their voice consistently. So I should also say this is to some degree a more American thing. People practice singing a lot more in other parts of the world than we do for whatever reason. There weren't very many people in choir when I was a kid. Hopefully this is changing a little bit. But, like in Europe and I've been to Kenya, and people sing all the time. They sing on the bus. They sing to their kids. I mean, it's just kind of part of the culture. It's less so part of the culture for us to sing in public that much, just kind of casually, right? So it really has to do with practice. It has to do with kind of the way our muscles control our voice. Some of us are better at that than others. Practice helps that, but only up to a degree. So we might not have the right muscles. But it doesn't have to do with something in our brains necessarily, the way, we're trying to, create a consistent pitch. I mean, when they ran the experiments, they found two singers that were pretty bad. I'm not great, but you probably have friends that are even, worse than me. But even with those bad singers, they had no trouble with the tempo. They just had trouble with the pitch a little bit. So maybe they sounded like, like this. Let's see. It's not that terrible. So let me try to get it a little worse. Okay, that's how I sing. No, that's how somebody might sing. So they might be noticeably off, and this is something that you do see in, God, I can't remember that show, The Next Big Music Star That Sings, or whatever that show is called. But even when they're bad at pitch, their tempo is, again, really, really good. It's like Adele. It's like the Barbershop Quartet. Your tempo stays consistent. And then when they brought these people back, because they were really wondering if there was something unique about them, and they actually asked them to judge pitches and whether the two pitchers were the same or different. And they showed no deficit in perception at all. They showed no, kind of hindrance in saying whether these notes are the same or different. Are they the same or different? Most people would say different, and that would be right, and so would these people. Those are the same. So when it came to actually perceiving pitches, they were perfectly fine. So it probably had something to do with their the way they control their vocal tract when they're trying to sing, and that's something that can be improved at least to some degree. Okay, at least to some degree. There are people, however, that really do have trouble hearing pitches. Okay, and that's sometimes called tone deafness. Okay, however, when people are asked this question, are you tone deaf? People will often respond yes, even though they are just not great singers. So I'm sure that's a term that was used when the experimenters went up to people in Quebec and say, hey, would you mind singing for us? We're doing a study on how good normal people can sing. Probably a lot of people said, oh, no, I'm tone deaf. And so as it turns out, about 15 to 20% of the population says they're tone deaf. And these people might have trouble reproducing pitches, matching pitches. Like I did before. I was a little shaky when I tried to get myself to sing this pitch. You can still hear I'm a little shaky. A little better than before maybe, but still kind of shaky. But these people were really bad. These people were pretty bad, so they might do this. Okay, they were pretty shaky. There's about 17% of people have trouble doing that to that degree. Not a lot. Most people are not tone deaf. Most people sing better than they realize and have the potential to sing better than they realize. And even for that 17%, they don't have problems perceiving the pitches. They would know that this tone is higher than this tone, which would be higher than this tone. Okay? Pretty much all those people would. But there is a small part of the population called amusex, or they have amusia. And that's a 4% of the population. It's not a lot of people, okay? It's a pretty small portion of the population that can't really tell pitches very well. They can't tell that this is an ascending scale and this is a descending scale. They can't tell that this note is lower than this note. And it's not a lot of people. And by the way, that type of thing is, you have to have a little practice to know that. So if you're thinking right now, if I asked you which note is higher, this note or this note, most people would say the second note, but if you can't, that doesn't mean you have amusia. It just you might not know what to listen for. There are people that even if they are taught what to listen for, still can't do that sort of thing. So if you don't have a lot of musical experience, and you've wondered if you can't sing well, I don't want you to get scared. Very few people have amusia. Only 4%. It's not a whole lot. So I wouldn't worry too about it. But they do have poor perception. They do have trouble determining whether a scale is going in an ascending or a descending direction, or whether one note is higher or lower than a second. Okay? But their rhythm is fine. Their tempo is fine. They don't have trouble dancing. They don't have trouble appreciating music at all. Okay? It's just that, when it comes to that type of judgment, they have a little problem, but it's very, very few people. Okay. Let's now move on to memory and talk about pitch memory and rhythm memory. Okay. And here's something I found. This is one of these pieces that I found really, really, really surprising. That when you think of a song, so what's your favorite song right now? What's that song by Lil Nas? That Old Town Road, da 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 da. That's your favorite song now, right? Was that? It's from last summer, isn't it, or something like that? I don't know what. Somebody tell me what the song of this summer is. I don't know. I haven't been listening to. It's interesting. My younger son especially likes listening to kind of FM pop radio in the car, and since sadly we haven't been going anywhere, I haven't been keeping up with pop radio. So maybe you folks can tell me what some of the new songs that are popular are. What every summer there's a kind of a song of the summer that's considered kind of maybe this summer's going to be a hard one, but it's typically kind of a lighter song, kind of one that's more upbeat and danceable, and sing. You can sing along with it. You'd hear it at the beach. Maybe this isn't the greatest summer to have a song of the summer, but last summer I think it was that Lil Nas song was popular, and you could sing along, and everyone had a little dance to it, and all that sort of stuff. It's that sort of thing. And the thing is, when you think about that song, you would think, okay, so what key am I remembering it? Now, here's the thing let me tell you a little bit about musical keys or pitches, okay? So I could play the Lil Nas song in this key. Isn't it awful when a middle-aged guy sings a hip song? Something like that, right? Well, that's just a key I chose to sing it in. It's this one. But I could play it in any other key. I can't believe I'm recording this. Okay, you get the idea. I could also play it up here. Right? Okay. Lil Nas, I don't know how. You guys didn't suggest any songs, so this is the one I ended up with. It's your fault. The thing is, I can play it in any key. There's 12 different keys I could play it in. Okay? I could play it in any of those keys. And so when you think back to that Lil Nas song, before I just ruined it for you, do you think that you remember it in the actual key that you sang it in, or that you first heard it in? Or do you remember it in a key maybe that would be easier for you to sing or something like that? And the interesting thing is, surprisingly, when we remember a melody of, say, a song we've heard on the radio, we, in fact, remember it in the same key that we actually heard it in when we first heard it. So let me give you an example of this. People could come into the laboratory and be asked to sing their favorite song, okay? So maybe it's the Lil Nas song, or Hello by Adele, or I don't know, something else. I'm trying to think of songs that have very distinct melodies. You guys can share them with me later if you want. But their favorite song. And when they do that, they sing it very close to the key that it was heard in. And we're talking about non-musicians now. We're not talking about professional singers by any means. We're talking about people who, don't do anything professionally, maybe have never even taken a music lesson, possibly. But when they are singing the song, and these are people that feel like they really can't sing that well, may even say they're tone deaf, they sing it very close to the original key. So if Lil Nas' song is okay, say it's in that key, the original version of it, they might sing it a tiny bit above, but they're not going to sing it way up here, right? Okay, they're going to sing it very close to the original one. Also, moms sing lullabies in the same pitch week after week. So you ask moms to come in with their babies, and you ask them to sing a lullaby to the baby. What's a rock-a-bye baby on the treetop? Hopefully you folks got better lullabies when you were kids, but I wasn't that creative. Except for Smoke on the Water. I used to sing that one a lot, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But Rock-a-Bye Baby, for example. The moms would come in and they'd be asked to, there's your baby, go ahead, sing it a lullaby and do your best job. They'd be recorded. And then they'd be asked to come back in a week and sing it again. And they would sing it on the same pitch, basically. How's that go? Rock-a-bye. I don't know how Rock-a-Bye Baby goes, but you understand the idea. It'd be in the same melody or something, and it would be very close. It would be almost the exact same pitch when they came back the second time. The other way of revealing how pitch memory works is really cool, and it has to do with listening to songs that you've heard before. And so here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play songs that you are familiar with. I think you'll know the first one right off the bat. And I'm going to play them in two different keys. Okay? Remember, this is a key, Old Town Road, da, 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 or this is another key, da, 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 right? I'm going to play these songs in two different keys. And even though they're going to sound pretty good in both keys, I want you to tell me which of the two versions, the first or second, is in the key from the original version of the song that you've heard for years and years and years. I think you'll know this song pretty well. Okay, so you know what that is, right? It's the theme to The Simpsons. Hopefully you all recognize that. You've probably heard that most of your life, right? Whether on purpose or not, it's a very, very, well-known theme. And the question is, was the first version you heard the version from the TV show or the second version you heard? They both sounded good, right? And, you might know this if you do some music, that it's very easy now to use a computer to kind of shift the pitch of something that's recorded. You could pretty much use almost any free program to take one of your streaming songs and shift the pitch so maybe you can sing along more easily if you wanted to. And that's what this was done with for these examples. But my question is, after this was done, which was the one that was shifted and which was the original version? Is the first version original or second version original? Let me play it again. Okay, tell me, what do you think? I actually want you to respond now. Was it the first or second version that was the original version? Let's see how you did. Okay. Yeah. Okay, well, let's split a little bit. Not everyone's perfect at this. There is some difference, but I will tell you, most people said the second version, and that is correct. The second version of the song is the one from the original TV show. Now, again, they both sound fine. I mean, it's very easy to change the pitch for these things without making it sound distorted or anything like that. But you seem to have a memory of the original song, which is pretty amazing. All right, let me go ahead and do another one because this is so fun. We'll do another song. I think you'll know this song too. I think most people know this. Let me play him again. What do you think, first or second? Yeah, it's Friends. It's Friends. It's Friends. And most people know this song. If you don't know this song, I can understand that, you know, you may not be able to do this, but it is, yeah, people are getting this one too. This again is the second one. It's the second version, and most of you are getting this. Brick out it, I am. Got it. Yep. Great. All right. Just one more. I don't need to know your answers for the next one, but let's go ahead and play the next one. Oops. Yeah, there we go. Actually, I'm not sure you guys are going to know this. This is, I think, from this version is from Jeopardy. It's the Final Jeopardy song. Okay, you don't need to tell me, but the answer there is the second one. And, you know, people are pretty good at this. You know, you were all pretty good. You know, there was some split for the first song, but for the most part, people did really well. And that's what you find, that adults can do this. They can judge whether TV themes are correct key or shifted between 1 and 2 semitones. The example you heard was a shift of 2. Oh, wait. Oops, sorry. Versus. Okay, that was a shift of 2 semitones. So that was actually pretty easy for most folks. And people can get this, even though they've never been asked to do this before. Their memory does contain something about the actual pitch. Again, it could have been in any key. Right? It could have been in any key at all, but for some reason your memory is able to do this. All right, infants also can do this to some degree, or at least as early as they can be tested. Infants that are 7 months old can show that they are also sensitive to the pitches of lullabies and things like that. They are not quite as accurate as adults, but they're still very, very good at it. And the same thing is actually true of not just pitch memory, but rhythm memory. If I instead played the Simpsons theme a tiny bit speeded up, a very tiny bit speeded up, versus its regular pace, you'd be able to very simply tell me which one was real and which one was wrong. The same with the Friends theme or anything like that. Your sensitivity to a distortion in pitch, either speeded up or slowed down, just a tiny, tiny bit, is even more sensitive than your pitch memory. You know, the next point I need to talk about is a little complex, so I think we should stop here and we'll finish our discussion of music next class and then get into smell. So thanks a lot. Oh, there is a quick question. Let me just see if we got that. Oh, Britt was judging. Yeah, actually, I should let you know, on all the examples I played you, it always was the second was the correct answer. It's just the way that they had posted the stimuli examples on their website. So yes, the answers for all these was the correct answer was the second version of them. Thank you very much for participating. And we will see you folks on Thursday.